Welcome back to Food for Therapy Season 2. I'm your host, Therese Bolden. Welcome to the show that combines my training and specialties of psychotherapy and counselling and writing with my passion of food and hosting and culture. And on this episode, I have a wonderful guest, the lovely Grazyna Zajdow, yes, sociologist. Yes, and our topic is a wonderful topic, the importance of community and living and dealing with someone with addictions. Now, the food that I decided to make today, Grazyna, is everything is homemade, as I mentioned, because you are a vegetarian. I specifically wanted to do a mezza plate, an Egyptian mezza plate, which consists of eggplant, capsicum that I roasted myself, pickled lemons, homemade hummus with coriander and parsley. I've got an olive and assorted tomato salad. And I've got a national dish here that we Egyptians eat every day, and it's called fool, and it is basically a macerated broad bean with beautiful olive oil and coriander and salt, pepper and lemon. So all the recipes for all the food will be on our social media. So let's get stuck into our topic. Now, welcome to my table. Welcome to my home.
Thank you.
Now, Grazyna, it's a really interesting topic that you and I have discussed previously, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit more. And so your PhD research was on women who have been partnered with alcoholic men and reconstruction of their lives through mutual aid groups and community. Can you explain what that means?
The mutual aid in particular, is that what you mean?
But why specifically you chose this as a topic?
Well, I had finished a master's in sociology, and it had been on the lives of Italian migrant women in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And I had done that because I had just come back after living for a couple of years in Italy, and I had realised that I was, in a sense, doing my mother's journey backwards, in that I went as an adult into a country, the language of which I didn't speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to learn the language, I had to work, and I realised that I was reconstructing in a way, or trying to understand her journey. And so when I came back to Australia, it was the question of what I was going to do my master's on, and I looked at Italian-born women in Australia, because I could use the language and various other contacts that I had.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, I was wondering, what do I do after this? Because I can't imagine not doing this research work. And I happened to be in a situation where I had married somebody who was an alcoholic, and I thought I could use that experience I was interested in that experience, as most sociologists do. I do my research. My research at least starts from my experience.
Right.
I hope it expands much more. My experience is not the point of it, but it's that interest comes from my experience. And so I moved from there. There were a couple of other topics I could have done, but this one, in essence, I thought was an easier topic to do than the others.
Easier? How so easier?
Well, I don't actually want to talk about the others particularly, but they would have had me dealing with people who were doing illegal things. So I decided I didn't want to do that.
Who's they?
The topics that I might have taken up,
right,
involved various illegal activities. So this one involves illegal activities as well, but also various other lives that, in a sense, I was trying to step back from. So
to move away from that.
Yes, right. So I decided to do this one instead.
So what about your experience of living with someone with addiction made you go, this is where I want to put my research? And when did that happen for you?
I'm trying to think of the timing. I was in the middle of my master's when Stephen and I married.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a couple of years into our relationship, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And he had I think that at that point he had been through a number of hospitalizations for his alcoholism, and he was sober, well sober at that point. So I think that what he was going through and various other people that I met made me decide that this was, and looking at the literature in sociology, I realized at the time too, there was actually very little of it at the time. It exploded after that, but nonetheless, when I started, there wasn't very much of it. There seemed to be very little interest in the partners of alcoholic men, except in I have to say in psychoanalytic literature, which was exceedingly woman blaming and was problematic. So I decided that I would like to change the discussion there.
So you're in a relationship with your husband who was then an alcoholic, but he was sober, and you decide you're going to do some research on women who live with alcoholic men.
Mm-hmm.
And what did you discover?
Oh, I discovered a lot. But essentially, my argument was that this is a group of women who, for the most part, are doing in their relationships with these alcoholic men what they would do with any other partner that they might have. That is, they cared, they did the caring work, and that a lot of the issues around this relationship were issues of the gendered nature of caring work.
Right. So your thesis or your hypothesis was that women specifically took on the caring role because of their gender. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
So what specifically, as an example, can you give that you did in that context? What did you do as a woman for him?
Well,
what was natural for you to do for him? I mean, he's your husband, so I would imagine, there was a lot of things that you did do without even consciously registering it.
Well, it was, and I'm not sure that I could be set up as a particularly good example of the gendered nature of caring, because I specifically, not specifically perhaps, but I really had a problem with the notion of women caring in classic heterosexual relationships in any case. I never intended on being a wife in any way. Actually, I've been married twice, but I've never really liked the idea of marriage altogether. So that wasn't my intention. I married because he wanted to be married.
Right.
Now I understand why he wanted to be married, but at that point I didn't. It was so important to him. Okay, that's fine. I knew at the time. I thought at the time it would be easy to get out of it if it was a problem, but it wasn't so easy in the end. And but I did have, if you like, an ideological problem with the notion of women's gendered labour in families.
But so what I'm hearing you say is that you per se didn't carry out a lot of the caring roles that other women who had partnered with addictive men had done.
I thought I didn't.
And what did you discover?
I discovered that I became the main breadwinner. Because he couldn't hold down a job, and that the labour around making sure that he was taken care of, that is, we had private health insurance for his hospitalizations. We lived in my house, and I paid, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, I paid the bills to make sure that if he couldn't work for whatever reason, that we would be okay. So it wasn't that classic one, but it was whatever caring meant to me at the time, that's what I was doing.
Right. Okay. And how long did you last in the marriage? How long was the marriage for?
20 years.
Wow. So that's a long time to be in a role that you, I guess, when you're in it, you're not aware that you're doing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you perceive to be very, very antiquated, very traditional in a sense, something that you didn't really want to subscribe to, and yet you're in a role where you're caring for him. But what about what was the toll for you? What was happening for you in that sense? What toll was it taking for you?
Mm.
And so there was obviously something there that kept you there for that period of time. What was that?
I adored him. He did. He kept me there.
Right.
And I think, and I know that he loved me. I mean, I do know that he.
Of course, yeah.
Well, it's not always the case. I would never always say, of course, but I know that he did, and not just because he told me so, but he cared about what I did. He cared about my work. He cared about my life.
Right.
We seemed to get on and have so much of what each of us really loved doing. We did together, and for example, I really love ballet and dance.
Right.
And there are very few men who will happily, especially he was a sportsman, especially somebody who goes out and plays sport. I don't know about it. He came to the ballet and dance with me all the time because he learned to love it. He loved it. He liked the idea of movement in space, just like I love the idea of movement in space. We were both lovers of film. We would go out to the movies at the drop of a hat and to see all sorts of different films. He was not the sort of man who would not go and see a film because it's a girly flick.
Right.
He was not anti-feminist in any way. So that was always, that would have been a bridge too far for me, somebody who considered himself anti-feminist.
What does feminist mean to you?
A political ideology of women as a class having less power than men as a class or a group. And that power plays out in various different ways.
Right.
And that there is such a thing as a patriarchy, even if individual men, and lots of individual men, do not play into that, nonetheless it exists. And he had no argument with any of that. I mean, that was the lovely thing about it. He had no argument with any of that.
Right.
The only thing that we really didn't have in common was he wasn't much of a music fan. Anyway, so, but, those are the things that were important to me, and they were important to him as well. And he didn't see them as problematic. He didn't see my friends as particularly problematic, at least not at first. I realised later on that somehow, for some reason, a lot of friends were dropped by the way. And part of that was my decision, for example, that once we realised that he really couldn't smoke dope and he couldn't drink anymore, there were a lot of groups of my friends that I moved away from. But at first, the reason I stayed for as long as I did, it was because of all those things that we did together. And he was really interested, even though he was an autodidact, he was interested in my work. And he would read that material that I wrote and I read about and all the rest of it. So that
made you feel valued and validated, obviously. So 20 years, you're with a man who you love, who is an alcoholic. It doesn't sound like he was incredibly highly functioning alcoholic. Or was he?
He would spend years sober, and he was highly functioning.
Right, when he was sober.
Right. But then when he drank or used other drugs, he did it at such a scale that very quickly he would destroy his health very quickly. And then there was this cycle that went on.
What was the impact on you? How did that affect you?
Living with somebody who has a relapsing mental illness is really difficult. There are times when I was having a very hard time at work, and otherwise I would have left work, but I couldn't because I knew
you were supporting him.
That's right. We couldn't afford for me to leave. There was a period when I realised that one of my qualities, psychological qualities, that was also an undoing of mine, was perseverance. I do things until they're finished.
Right.
The problem with a marriage is you don't know when it's finished, really, until it's finished. So, I kept going. I kept going until I realised whatever it was at an end. But I didn't drop things. I felt compelled to keep going. Yeah.
And so that would be a tremendous burden. I mean, I would imagine that would wear you down emotionally, being the only one who not only has to work to support someone else, but you're also dealing with someone. What was his mental illness that he had?
Well, I think I'd argue that the addiction is a mental illness. Right. In and of itself, it's a mental illness.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. Yep. And that would definitely wear you down. That would take its toll. And okay. But would you know when he was going to relapse, or when he was going to?
Oh yeah. I mean, that was the thing. Even before he picked up a drink, there was something about how he said something, or what he said, or a look in his eye, and I'd know that whatever it was in his head, the switch that was going on in his head, it had been switched.
Wow. 20 years is definitely it's a lifetime. It's a long time. And so you were a carer, or you cared for him?
Well, I always cared for him, but there were times when there were a number of periods when he decided he was going to do his withdrawal at home. And actually, alcohol withdrawal is pretty hairy.
Right.
More people die from alcohol withdrawal than most other drug withdrawals.
Right.
And so there was always a problem of what would happen if the withdrawal went wrong.
Wow.
And so that was an issue if he was withdrawing at home, or if he wanted to go to be hospitalised, but he was still in the middle of the relapse, trying to get him to the hospital. Without him, for example, climbing out of the car window in the middle of traffic, which has happened on more than one occasion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm sure the audience is going to want to know the difference between, and you and I have discussed this before, what is the difference between a carer and caring? Because there is a difference.
Yeah. I mean, all human beings have the capacity to care for other individuals. That we have sympathy and empathy, and we don't want those who we love, or even if we don't have to love them, but other people, we don't want them to be in pain or in torment. That's it's effectively, in sociology, they talk about that distinction between caring about and caring for. And what I'm describing there is caring about. I care about another human being. I don't want them to be in pain.
Right.
But what I do to avoid that, to help them avoid that pain, or to do for them, that's caring for. That distinction is important, I think, because often what happens is that emotion that we have for another human being, that empathy, then sympathy we have for another human being, then translates into action that could actually be detrimental to the person carrying that action out.
Right.
So regardless of my caring about Stephen, that often the things that I would do for him that I think were necessary, or he wanted me to do for him to make things better for him, were not necessarily in my best interests. They were hard to deal with, emotionally straining, physically straining at times, financially straining, all those sorts of things that mean that that other person and often what would happen, especially in the middle of a relapse, is he didn't understand, like he didn't care. So,
I mean, I would imagine that by the very fact of you being married to someone with an addiction, that relationship is then enmeshed. It becomes very difficult to be able to decipher or actually stand at a distance and recognize that, I'm hurting myself, because you're in it and you're immersed in it and you're involved in it. And so I would imagine that you'd come in and out of caring for and caring, being a carer. Yeah. But what was the point where you recognized that you couldn't do it anymore? At what point do you say?
There were a number of points. So to describe the cycle. So he would become sober, and when he was sober, he would probably usually find work, or my house is renovated because he did all the renovations, those sorts of things. So, and we would be getting along really well, and that would sometimes that lasted for years. Sometimes it was months. It just depended what else was going on in his head, and then he would fall into this cycle. Then he would start drinking, and it would be a terrible thing. And he'd end up in hospital. I don't know how many times he was hospitalized for this. And during that time in the hospital, I would calm down, and he would, emotionally, I would calm down. And he would make promises about staying sober. Now I know the issue is that he had full intentions of carrying those promises out, but it was, once you start drinking, that it doesn't matter what your intentions are.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to believe him, and he was charming and lovely, and he was back to his usual self, and I wanted to believe that this time it was going to work. And once you're on that cycle, it's so hard to work out.
It's like domestic violence.
Yeah, that's right.
You're enmeshed in it. You become identified with him, the person that's causing you pain and distress and grief, and it becomes a Stockholm syndrome. You can't remove yourself from it. But at what point did you recognize, I need help, I need a community? And obviously I know we can't mention who your community is for confidentiality reasons, but at what point did you go, I need support from somewhere else? And did they help you exit the relationship, or the support from them?
It was pretty early on that I realized that I needed help. I had attended a few meetings, and that at first, but this was his first hospitalization, and I thought we were going to be fine. And a few months later, it didn't quite work out that way, and I reached a real physical and emotional low at that point. I was really physically ill and emotionally completely battered, and so I went back, and I decided that this was where I needed to be. It's interesting. It took many years, because this particular organisation, this particular group, is not set up and has no opinion on whether people should leave or not leave. That's not its business.
Right. So there's unconditional positive regard, no judgment.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
And whether somebody leaves or doesn't leave is really up to that individual, and there is no judgment about that.
Right.
So, and because it was interesting, I would, go, he would relapse, and if it was a particularly difficult one for him for whatever reason, I would come in distraught. And they would say, well, and I remember somebody coming up to me. I was really, really distraught this one time, and I remember her coming up to me, and she said, well, Grazyna, there is hope. And I said, oh, I hope he stays sober. She said, no, not hope for him. That's his business. There's hope for you.
Yeah.
And then
that's a lovely thing.
It was really, really lovely. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Which, I guess is kind of an epiphany. You realize that you have agency and you have choice, especially when, you know, you're in a relationship where, like I said, you become enmeshed in this dynamic, and it becomes very difficult to then see what's going on. Yeah. And so that was a turning point for you. And
It was still many years before I finally made the decision that I didn't want to go on with it.
Yeah. But how else did the group support you, aside from their unconditional positive regard? What else did they do in terms of support?
Well, there was always somebody at the end of the phone.
At any time?
Never thought about ringing them up in the middle of the night, but yeah. There were individuals who I became very close to, who helped me. That there was quite a large number of meetings, so I could always every day I could find a meeting somewhere at some time. The other thing about this particular group is that they don't have any positions on any outside issues. They don't discuss anything outside.
So from what I'm understanding, this is a group of people that are experiencing challenges in the same way, and there's no professional person, there's no therapist.
Nope.
It is just the group of people who are going through the same. Okay,
yeah.
Wow.
And so it's highly democratic in that way too, and it's been around for a very long time, and it's always, in a sense, it's always there. And again, that whole process of no judgment. It did mean that somebody in my position who was, you know, I was at the time, and I am now even more so, highly educated, arrogant about my education, I'd say. And they would smile very sweetly and say, just keep coming back, just keep coming back. It's all right.
Yeah,
it's all right.
Of course.
And finally, I understood that they accepted me, even though actually to a large extent, I was not like them. I didn't have children. I didn't grow up in an alcoholic family. I don't know anybody's particular politics, but I'm pretty sure that, you know, there were lots of people who wouldn't have had the same politics as me. But none of that mattered. One, we try not to talk about those sorts of things in any case. But the other thing about it was that I was accepted one way or another. It didn't matter who I was. Yeah.
What a lovely support for you.
Yeah. So the decision about when to go, and you know, I would often go in and feel terrible, and I'd be crying about how is it possible that every time he says he's going to stay sober, I believe him, and I know that it's not true, and it's not even his fault, but I know that it's not true. And you know, they were always there, and somebody, you know, would every once in a while say, "You'll know when it's time."
Oh, absolutely.
You'll know when it's time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I definitely believe that. I think that, you know, people are ready when they're ready. That's the reality of it. Nevertheless, it would be a very challenging situation for you to be in, you know. So there was no physical abuse towards you?
No. It's interesting. He was, as I said, he was a sportsman. He was tall, and well built, but he was never physically aggressive in any way. But he was highly intelligent, and he had a mouth on him, and he could remember. I mean, I can barely remember, and I don't drink and I don't smoke anymore, so I can barely remember what I did or said yesterday, and he will remember. He would have remembered what I had said when he was sober, and I admitted something to him when he was sober, you know, months or years before, and it would come out in a dreadful way when he was drinking. That was his aggression. His aggression was completely verbal, he was an unpleasant drunk in that way, like really an unpleasant drunk. And the other thing about it was that when he was drinking uncontrollably, he would fall over, and he was physically dangerous in that way. You know, you had to move things away from him because he would fall into things. Yes,
it would be Look, I think we've discussed this before. Having grown up in a domestic violent home, it would be a very unnerving experience to be in that kind of environment because you're never sure what you're going into. Do you know what I mean? And on the flip side of that, the silver lining is that it teaches you a lot about people. You learn about people very quickly, you know, because you've had to, if you're in survival mode.
Yeah.
So I would imagine it would be very similar in that way. But hold on to those thoughts because we're going to go for a quick break. Don't go anywhere. Come back and join me and join the lovely Grazyna when we have a cup of tea and some berries and some chocolate and maybe continue on with this lovely food and our conversation. See you soon.